Hey everybody, the goal of this video is to show you how to take the selfie stick parts that you downloaded from the curriculum, assemble them together into the actual selfie stick, to which you can then put into an animation and show an exploded view of them. You can even get into the timeline of this and play it from front to back with some pretty cool animation. Totally up to you how intense you make this part, but I'll show you the ropes as we move forward. And then also to put it into an assembly drawing sheet like you see here, full with a parts list and balloons relative to the parts list for each of the parts, and a couple of dimensions that show how the different components of this selfie stick are organized relative to each other and how far apart they are. All right, let's get into it. To start off, I have a folder that I've created to store my 213 and 214 files. We're going to do this activity as kind of a combination of 213 and 214, so this video and my therefore file storage represents that. In this folder you'll see that I already have the selfie stick assembly and the assembly drawing, as well as some assembly videos that I took of that animation. These are optional, but definitely fun to play around with. We'll create all new files for this video, so let's start at the beginning. To kick it off, I'd go up to File, come down to Open, come over here to Open from my computer where I can find that I've saved these selfie stick files. I'll open them up, and here they are. Now it's at this point that you have to decide what becomes your grounded object, what becomes the object that you're going to remove all 6 degrees of freedom. You could essentially pick any of these objects to do that with, but the component that I'm going to pick is this shoe top right here, and I'll go ahead and highlight it just to show you. And while up here in the browser, I'll right click and go to ground. And this will remove all 6 degrees of freedom of just that part, and notice there's a little pin in the icon over in the browser. So now this component is locked into place. It will not move. The other thing I'm going to do is go ahead and turn off a couple of files or a couple of components that I don't need turned on at the moment, like the phone holder top and bottom. I really don't need the stick bottom or stick top at the moment. I just need these components that you see here, plus one that I'll insert a little bit later using the Insert from McMaster Car component button. The order in which you assemble these isn't really as important as you might think, but it is important that you put them together in the correct orientation. But if you're going to follow along with me, this is the order in which I do it. So over the next couple of minutes, you'll see that I'll take this screw, assemble it so that it goes through this hole inside of the shoe top. Now this screw that you see here is technically called the shoe. This is called the shoe bottom. I'll highlight it there for you. And we'll take the shoe top, put it on either side of the shoe, and put the shoe bottom on the bottom of it. And then we'll connect all of those things to the stick adapter. And at that point, we'll save our file and we'll move on from there. All right, I'll zoom in on this a little bit. First thing that we're going to talk about using are the joints. Now, if it pops up a window that says that you should keep position or capture a position, you're definitely going to want to capture a position as you start to move forward. If you keep position, you may run into some errors. Mine does not do that. It could be that it's just a newer version of Fusion. But with this chosen, I will come in and tell it where I want to move components to. Now keep in mind, this one is grounded, so anything that I join to it, anything that I assemble to it, that object will move to this shoe top. So I'm going to start by showing you what the different joint motions and positions are. Under the Motion tab, you can see that we have a bunch of different types of constraints. There's rigid, revolute, slider, cylindrical, pin slot, planar, and ball. We're mostly going to use these first 3, rigid, revolute, and slider, though there is some argument for using cylindrical, and if you looked closely enough at some of the files I showed you a moment ago, I did use cylindrical for some of my components. We'll talk about that. You don't necessarily need to use them. You really only need these 3 to make this object work. So back here under position, we see that there's one component and a second component. That's going to be the shoe top and the shoe itself. I'll pick simple as opposed to between two faces or two edge intersections for most of the assembly joints that I work with during this video. You also have the option of snapping by selecting what you want to make as a joint between two components. And in this case, I'm going to zoom in here on the shoe, and I'm going to pick this outside circle for the threaded rod that's part of this entire object. Be careful that you don't select something further out. It really is best to pick this one. So we'll pick this threaded rod's furthest out or smallest circle, I suppose I should say. And then over here, the second component, notice that it defaults to selecting that, will be this shoe, and I'll just pick this circle here. And what we see is that it moves over and it lines up with it. But the problem is it's turned in the wrong direction. So, and you may have to scroll down if you can't see it, but in this window, you'll see flip, and that'll flip it over. All right, that's great. That puts it right where I want it to be. Works just fine, just like that. And I'll say, okay. Now you may find that it's useful to just pick the center of this shoe and attach it with a rigid constraint to the center of this face. And that's totally fine. It does work, but you wind up having this weird intersection between this material of the shoe bottom and this material of the shoe top. So what I'm going to do is make sure, one, I'm on rigid, and then for my positions, I'll pick to have, say, this edge here, and let's go with this edge here and see what we get. And it moves over, but the problem again is it's in the wrong position, so I'll just flip it over. And now if you go to a top view of this, you'll see that the shoe does not rest on this face of the bottom, or of the shoe bottom. It would if you had picked the center of that shoe circle and the center of this planar face that this edge represents here of the shoe bottom. But in this way, I can keep them right up on the edges of each other and then still have room to adjust this screw if this were in real life. I'll click OK and move on to the next part, back over here in a home view, and that leaves me with the shoe adapter and getting it attached over here. Now later on, we're going to want this shoe adapter to be able to rotate up and down, so we're going to use a slightly different constraint here. Under motion, we're going to check revolute. And then we'll say for the position that we want to choose this hole right here on the edge of it, just like that. And then we want to come over to the opposite side of the shoe bottom and choose this hole. And it drags it over and puts it in place, and you'll see that it spins it through a full 360 revolution. I'll say OK and lock it into place, and we'll deal with its limits in a few minutes. Now at this point, you can see that all I have to do is click and drag this thing around, and it'll move up and down. It'll move all around. It really doesn't matter at the moment where it's positioned because we're going to attach some other things to it. Just out of simplicity purposes, I'm going to go ahead and move it back to pretty much flat like this, close to a 90-degree angle. So now that I have aligned this fairly well, I'm going to come up here to Insert and go to the Insert McMaster Car component. This is something that we're pretty sure your computers will let you do, but if not, don't worry, we can get you access to this file as well. This is a particular type of fastener company. McMaster Car is a pretty popular company, has a lot of different things that we can use here. And one of the things that we want to search for, which we can find in the curriculum, is this particular component, 911-85A911. And if we search for that, we'll find that it is a fully threaded 1-inch rod with 2 arms on it, 10/32 screw, and we want to go to product details. It'll probably default as being something like a SolidWorks file. You want a 3D step file and then tell it download. It'll take it a moment, but it will put it in here, and it'll put it in pretty much where you don't want it to be. So before you say OK to this, and you want to bring it over like so, and drop it in after you've rotated it 90 degrees would be ideal, because this is the direction that we're going to put this thing in, and so it just kind of makes sense to drop it in like this. And we'll say OK to it. And then now we want to put this threaded screw into this hole using, and again, this is your choice, but probably the easiest thing to do would be a rigid. You could also go with a revolute and have kind of a threading action, a twisting action. As part of this, you could also put it in as something that is cylindrical so that it slides as well as having some type of revolute. Now it is up to you, but for the simplicity of this video, I'm just going to use rigid. Now in rigid, for position 1 or component 1, I'm going to pick this hole right here, and then back on the screw itself, I'll pick this inside hole right there, or inside part right there, and you'll notice that it moved the first component that I selected. Now, if you don't want that to happen, keep in mind the shoe top is locked into place. If you don't want that to happen and are concerned by it, you can reselect in the correct order by just hitting these X's and choosing them in the correct order so that they move in the way that you think that they're going to when you're assembling them. And then I'll say OK to this, and you'll notice it does just snap right back into position because we also had the shoe adapter attached to the shoe bottom. So the shoe top being locked into place kept everything in line, and it moved everything back. So just keep that in mind. Once I have this all set up, I'm going to go up here to a top view and notice that my shoe adapter is resting right here on the edge of this shoe bottom. And I want to eliminate that. I want to create a gap that's on both sides of that shoe adapter in between, or on both sides of the shoe bottom in between the shoe adapter forks. So if I come back to the constraint that I used to put that into place, and let's see here, that is the joint that's right here. I'll edit that joint, and if I slide this joint back and forth here, I see that I get a 0.05, negative 0.05 snaps it to the other side. Now if you're zoomed out a little bit, you may want to zoom in and you'll see this, but the closer in I am, the better. So if I take this thing and move it back out here to 0.05, negative 0.05, my Z offset is what's showing that, and I want to split that difference. I want to say 0.025, negative 0.025 should straighten that up for me, and I'll say OK. And now I have a gap on both sides of it. And then it's at this point that you're going to want to save it, and I've already called it Selfie Stick version 1, so I'm good to go with saving a new version of this, and we'll move on to the next part. So for this part of the video, I've turned on stick top and stick bottom. You can see that here. I'll zoom back out a little bit and show you that they are in fact over here. I want to drag them closer to where I'm working, so I'll pull them over. And I want to take the stick top component and attach it with, in this case, just a rigid constraint is fine. And I want it to go into this hole that we see here. So I'll choose this edge of the threaded rod and this edge of the hole, flip them, and say OK. Now for this stick bottom, it actually slides back and forth on this stick top. And so for that, I want to use a slider. So I'll choose slider, position, component 1, component 2. Again, choosing those inside holes, or the inside hole with this edge that I see here. And you can see there's a bit of a clearance fit here. And I'll go ahead and flip that so that it goes the correct direction. Say OK. And now you can see that this slides back and forth, and this goes up and down. With that said, let's talk about how do we put in some type of limit for how these things move, because technically this bottom part of the stick can slide right off the top, and I can still revolve this stick all the way through the entire shoe, and I definitely don't want that to be the case. All right, let's get over to a left side view so we can see this nice and easy. And then I find that there's some constraints that are on here, things like the slider, this joint, there's this revolute that's right here. Let's start with the revolute. if I double click on the Revolute, you see that I can come in and drag this slider all the way around. It allows me to finely control the revolution of this particular joint. What I really want to do, and I'll hit escape here, is click on that, then right click on it and edit joint limits. It's at this point that I need to determine what's my minimum, maximum, and rest position for this. What I found is that -180 for the minimum, maximum of 0, and a rest at -90 produces the best results. This allows for, and I'll go ahead and animate this here, that shoe adapter to rotate through about 180 degrees with it resting at the -90 position. Now if I say OK here, it keeps it at that position for me. If not, you can always come back into here and double click on this and tell it to rotate around as you see fit and tell it where to go. And you'll see that if you don't have a super great graphics card, it might wig out a little bit like mine does whenever I try to push it past its limits. Or if I let go of it, it may want to keep it in that same particular spot. You can always type in -90 and tell it enter. Now this worked for the orientation and setup that I have. This may not be what comes out as the best options for you with the way that you assembled it. You'll have to play around with those numbers to figure it out. With that said, I can also take this slider or this outside part of the stick bottom, and slide it back and forth. And I want it to have some limits as well. Now these sticks are about 12 inches long. So when I mess with the slider for that and I come in to edit its joint limit, I'm again going to deal with a minimum and maximum here. Okay, so let's see what happens if I start playing around with these numbers some. So in messing around with them, let's see. It's let's go with -12 here. Well, that's the entire extent of the stick. Let's bring it in about an inch. So -11, and we'll keep the maximum at 0. So going from -11 inches from where it's oriented all the way back to the maximum position of 0, back where we started with it, should work out just fine. If I animate this, I see that it does slide, comes back, touches 0, and returns to about 11 inches. So we're good there. We'll go ahead and say OK to that. And then you can see that I can still slide this thing forward and backward, but it's now stuck to those limits. I can't get it to slide any further than that, and it won't go through the shoe adapter any longer. So now I've got it in a good position, and I'll just leave it right there. Okay, so we have now a lot of this assembled, and I'll go ahead and hit save again. You should save often. And I'll turn on the last two components, the phone holder bottom and the phone holder top. And this gives us the ability to play around with the last two pieces, but you'll notice they're already assembled together with a slider constraint. Now you could go in to this joint, which is not part of what I've already created. So you either want to come up here and click on it within there, or you can find it inside the timeline. And that's this one right here. And I'll go ahead and say that I want to edit the limits on this one, and you could do the same kind of thing. You can play around with this one a little bit as well. Now I happen to know that if you are working with this one, you'll probably find that it's good to play with somewhere around an inch in how much it moves. I think it's got about an inch and a half, maybe 1.4 inches that it can go up before it slides out completely. Here, I'll bring it up to 2 and show you. Yeah, so you've got around probably about an inch and 4/10. It's actually a little too much. So if we bring it to an inch, let's go 0.7 just to be safe. We'll say that's as tall of a phone as I can have in there, and sure, I'll leave it like that. Now this is not necessary to do. This is just, in my opinion, something that you can play around with a little bit. You might want to, ignore the minimum. You might want to add a minimum to it. What's the smallest it can travel to as well? So maybe I say like it can go 0.1, right, at its minimum, or I maybe want it to go a little bit further than that, and maybe it can go all the way down to like -0.2, and you'll see that it drops down that far. So with that said, it is fine for you to play with that joint as well. If you'd like to lock that in, you can. Otherwise, it's already there and it's in place for you, so no need to mess with it if you don't want to do that extra little step here or there. Next thing I'm going to do is take this hole and attach it with, we'll just go with a rigid again here. So back to motion, rigid, and choosing under position. This is my first component. That hole gets attached all the way over here to this screw. And we'll go with not really the screw, but rather the shoe top. The hole for it right here is what I'm selecting. And if I put it there, I see that, yeah, it attached. And what I want to do is flip it so that it goes in the other direction. And as you remember, these two components are already attached to each other. And so once I say OK, it'll move both of them together. And I now have my fully assembled selfie stick, and it has some ability to move around as well. And again, I've limited some things here, so feel free to play around with this some as you see fit, and get it to where you like. If you want to come in and mess around with some of the edit joints and see what happens if you put in different values and see what you get, you're more than welcome to do so. It does definitely have an impact on how it's oriented. Now, in the end, you want to be sure that you have it set up so that it's in a very straight position and at its smallest that you'll allow for it to be. Go ahead and put this back at -90 here, and then readjust it, and I'll make this small. So we want to have it set up kind of like this and save this file. So that's the assembly. Let's now move on to animating this assembly. Under the workspace, we can change that workspace over to an animation, and you probably find that your animation timeline is not nearly set up like mine is. I have a tendency to put it up here with my comments and browser. Most of them will probably start off down here in the bottom and it'll be stretched out really far like this. You can move this thing all around wherever you want to put it. For my purposes, I'm just going to shrink it down a little bit over here. We're not really going to move past probably around 7 seconds or so, and I'll just set it up here. Okay, so you'll see that it starts off in whatever view you're set up in whenever you go into this animation workspace, and view is something that you can capture if you'd like to. And when you change a view and you tell it to go through some transformations, it does recapture those views. But just like anything else in this timeline, you can or in this animation timeline, you can adjust and delete if you'd like as well. I'm going to leave this view here. What I want you to keep in mind is you're looking for simple. You're not looking for something that's super complicated. I'm going to zoom out just a touch here just to show you that you can, and then go into the very basics of it. Transform is what we're going to be messing with the most, but there is obviously some other options within here that you could play around with later on. For what we're going to deal with, transform components is all we really need. So I'm going to choose transform, and it asks me to select a component. And I'll pick this this stick here. It's probably the easiest one to start off with, and I'll go ahead and move so that I have a little room up here. And I want to reinforce with you that you can put these components wherever you'd like. They will, in the end, need to fit close together, but in a way that you can apply some balloons to them and put them on a drawing sheet with this fully assembled view of your selfie stick. So keep that in mind. The more complex you make this, the harder it's going to be on you. So do try to keep in mind that this is your first time working with it, so go fairly slow and easy. I'm going to go ahead and tell this thing to move down and move so that it comes all the way off of that stick top. And that's pretty good. I don't really need to go too far as long as it does remove itself. I'm going to click up here in the transform components and say turn on the trail line visibility. And you'll see that there's now a tiny little dashed line there. And no matter where I place this thing, a little dashed line follows it. And it just shows the trail that it's taking as it moves. And then I'm also going to choose split transforms. And that's going to allow me now, instead of saying OK and picking new ones, that every time I give it a different movement, like say now over to the left by, I'll give it 4 inches, and then say back up again, it adds to that trail. And I'm going to tell it to come back up 12 inches. Okay, if I didn't have that split transforms on, it would do it like this. So I want the split transforms on so that it accounts for the movement over as well as the movement up. That's just going to make it a little cleaner, in my opinion. You play with this as you see fit. You can adjust things as needed. There's even some set pivot options that you can get into with this button here that if you have time, you might want to play around with it. It's kind of neat. You can decide where you want this to be located as far as on this object. Do you want it down here, or do you want it to make the movement relative to up here? It's up to you. I like to keep them where it defaults to. Then I'll say OK. And again, in effort of keeping this nice and simple, the only thing that I want to do next is pick this component now. So a new transform. Notice that my stick bottom had 3 components or 3 parts to its movement here, 3 transformations. So now with this stick top piece, I'm going to select it and move it down so that it comes out of the shoes adapter, and then have the trail line visibility turned on and split transforms turned on as well. And I'll move it now over to the left. And then I'll go ahead and leave it right there. That should be good enough for what I need. And I'll say OK. Notice that they're now overlapping with each other. Let's go ahead and play this and see how that looks. So you can kind of get them to move at the same times by moving them and adjusting them around on here. And in fact, even having them last about the same amount of time as well. So if I take this one, and I'll move this away just a second here, and adjust this down to roughly the same amount of time, bring this one over and adjust it to have roughly the same amount of time as that one, you'll see that when they move apart from each other, they move together. So the next component that I want to move is this screw that we put in. And for this screw, I'm going to go ahead and click on it first, and then bring it out to the right, have it show its trails, split its transformations, or split transforms, and then just bring it down this way, and I'll bring it down to right around -13. And then I'll say OK. And the next one that I'll choose is the shoe adapter. And again, I'll do the same thing, bringing it down as well. This one I'll bring down to -14. I'm trying to keep in mind as I do this how they'll be laid out as balloons. And as always, I'm trying to go fairly simple, fairly easy with my transformations. I'm not trying to do any kind of revolves or anything of that nature. It just gets in the way. If I don't need it to be revolved, then I'm not going to. And for the simplicity of this video, I'm just going to keep transforming these things down this way. This one I'll bring down to, let's go -11. Again, I want to show the trail visibility. I can do the split transforms if I need to, but because I'm not going to move it again, I really don't need that in there. And then I'll do the same for the rest of these components, continuing to move them back, just like you see here. Now, I don't technically need to have the line visibility turned on because it comes from the same place, but I'll go ahead and do it to show that it does come out of that hole. And I'm not going to move it again, so I don't need the split transforms turned on. And I'll do this component here, bringing it back as well, giving it some space to breathe. I'll go 6.5 with this one. Show its trails, and you'll see now these trails are starting to fill in. So for this one, I'm going to leave it turned off, and I'll say OK. And then I'll choose this last one, or the second to last one actually, because this is technically 2 components here. And I'll pull it out as well, and I'll bring it back. We'll go to 4.5, and I'll say trail visibility and tell it to stay. Well, let's see, if I turn trail visibility off, that'll work. I'll leave it like that. And then for this last one, I don't really need to move it, but I'm going to do it anyway just to show you that you can. And I'll bring this one down this way as well, just to keep it separated but still kind of close to everything else. If I turned on its trail visibility, it would be useless for us because it just shows where I moved it from, and I don't really need that. So I'll say OK, and now I have it all set up. Now what you'll see is that very easily they all kind of go together because I don't have the split transforms turned on for some of these things, and so when I play this, let's show you what happens. All right, so the only thing that I'm really concerned with at this point would be that this is where my plastic screw comes out, and I want it to come out a little faster, so I'm going to slow this down some and then move it over to the left slightly and then move this one over too, so that some of that happens a little earlier in the animation. And then we'll see how it goes. All right, screw comes all the way out, and then they all kind of move down together at the same time. That's nice. That worked really well. Okay, so I like this. This works for me. I might want to capture a new camera view so I can see all of it. So I could come in and say that this camera view here can get deleted, and I capture one here. Oh, view is not recording. Let's get it back over here. Okay. And we'll do view like that. And then I'll stretch this out a little bit. And we'll make it so that whenever it starts here, we'll move it out to this. Okay, so here's what that did. I'll back it up. I'll play it again. So I just had the camera back out a little bit as I get to the stick adapter bottom shoe top and phone stick or the phone holder bottom separating from the phone top. It kind of comes out a little further, if you will, as it moves down, so I can see the whole thing. So this is all part of basically my storyboard, right? This is what's been kept as storyboard 1. So I'm going to save this file, say OK to it, get that saved. All right, now we're ready to move on to the drawing sheet. So for the drawing sheet, I'm going to start off by being in design, and I'll say, okay, this all looks good. I like how this is, keeping in mind that this is technically my front view and this is technically my top view. This is what I'll wind up using as my front view, and I'll drop in a front and a side and what I'll refer to as the bottom, which is, based on the way I designed it here, the top or the front of the view cube. All right, like always, drawing in the workspace, and then from design, I need to create my template or have my drawing sheet created from my template. So be sure you select that. Everything else you can keep as is, and we'll say OK. And no need for me to keep this untitled file up here, so I'll go ahead and get rid of that whenever it opens up. All right, so this view that popped in, it definitely does not need to be that small, but I'll go ahead and move it to a top view. I'm going to make it, let's start with a 1:3. That's probably going to be too big. I'll put you back at a 1:4. We'll say OK to that. Close that up. And go ahead and get our projections in here. You're familiar with how this works. Gonna have a right side, and let's go with a bottom. We'll say OK to that. And we'll move these around as needed. You'll see why in a little bit that we need a little bit of room for this stuff. The animation that we just created is what we're going to use to put in as a new base view. And we're going to take, instead of the representation being from model, we're going to take it from storyboard 1. And you'll see here that as a 1:2, it's pretty good size. It does take up a good bit of room. We need to just put it in a place that makes sense for us. In this case, I'm going to bring it over here. I might find that, you know, it works best being all the way over here in this corner. This is really going to be up to you. I'm going to go ahead and turn on tangent edges here and say OK. And then you can leave it like this. You can have the color turned on if you want. You can have the shading turned on. I'm going to leave it turned off just for simplicity purposes and to help my graphics card not go crazy. I may wind up having to move these things around a whole lot more than where they are right now. I want to be sure that I have room for everything that I'm going to put in here. And the first thing that I'm going to put in is my balloon. And so each of these components will get a balloon, and you can just do the quick selection of balloon up here. It's also got a B for the keyboard command. I'll zoom in on this a little bit. Where I click on the component is where it will put the leader line, and so I'm going to bring this out, trying not to be horizontal or vertical if possible. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and bring this one out this way. Let's see, about like that should work. Ideally, you want to get these things to kind of be lined up with each other if possible. You may find that it works best to go back out to your exploded view, to your animation, and arrange it a little bit different and save your file and come in and drop in a new storyboard for it. Totally up to you, but as long as you can get this basic setup, you should be good to go. In fact, I'm going to redo that balloon. So I just did a Control Z to undo. I'm going to place it here. I'm going to put this one here. I'm going to do that one again. Zoom in on this a little bit. Bring it right from that edge. That'll work. I'll go from this spot here. This one goes here. And for these, I'll bring them out a little bit like this. And this one out here. And you can always arrange these individually as well. You know, obviously the more you're zoomed in, the finer control you'll have over them. But that looks pretty good. So once I have these balloons placed in here, and I don't really like that one, so let's see, you can get rid of it just by clicking on it and pressing delete. Let's try and place that one out this way. You can do that. It does cross the trail. If you can avoid crossing the trail, that is ideal. So maybe I get better with it being out like this, but then I'm crossed up here by the border, and that would mean that I need to move this entire view down. And when I do, it moves the balloons with it. So I can move this wherever I need it to be. I'm going to go ahead and put it kind of over here on this side, maybe even scale it up if I can, if it doesn't, you know, cause the balloons to get in the way. But they're in a good spot. This trail is kind of long, and I'm seeing that now as I'm coming into this view or into this drawing sheet. So, you know, think about how you want this laid out, how you want this to show that it gets assembled. It really is kind of up to you. We want to see that you're playing around with this a little bit, but also at the same time making decisions that make sense. The next thing that I'm going to need is a title block. No, I'm sorry, parts list. It goes next to my title block. So to put in the parts list, all I have to do is come up here to tables. And as you can see here, it's part of the tables option. So parts list, which relates very closely to balloons. And it says, what view do you want to create a parts list from? I want to create it from this exploded assembly view. Generates my parts list, and then I can put it pretty much anywhere. It does try to snap into places. This would be an ideal place to put it, but as you can see, it runs into some problems over here. Now, we could try to rearrange how this drawing is set up, and you know, maybe it'll fit if I put it in a particular way or rearrange things somewhat. So you could snap it in over here if you can get that to work. I'm going to snap mine down over here. And then I'm going to say to this thing that, hey, you're arranged incorrectly. Notice that it's got the parts list title down here, and then it goes up. I don't like that myself, so I'm going to double click on the lines for it, and I'm going to tell the table direction to be down. And then where I have description, I don't have a description for these things, so I can uncheck that, and it makes it a whole lot smaller. That might fit in this space over here. So you can come back now and rearrange it. You can move it if you want to just by clicking on it and dragging it around, but you do see that it has a hard time snapping into a particular place. You can try using the move tool and telling it that you want to select this to move and you want it to transform from point to point, from this point over to this point. And you see that, yeah, I'm still running into a bit of a problem. Now, again, you can arrange this as you see fit so that it does fit in here. And that's not too bad. That works fairly well as long as I can get my dimensions in on this drawing sheet. So I'll bring this down and I find that, yeah, that might work. I might be able to make that work for me. You may also find that it works better if this is kind of over further and maybe you bring these things down a little bit more. I don't know. But you got to play with it. You got to make it work based on what your assembly is showing. I'm going to go ahead and leave this like this for now and show you what I had from before. All right, what I really want to show you here is just how I've gone in and dimensioned the multi-view that I have, this front, right, and bottom view. And again, you can arrange these as you see fit. As long as it doesn't run into anything else, you should be good. You can also see that I did do some rotations with some of mine, some revolves with some of mine, and it worked well. I had some fun playing around with it, and I would encourage that if you're comfortable with this, you do the same kind of thing, but don't go crazy with it. Just keep it nice and simple. So I did put in some center marks and I put in a center line here to show that this part of this entire assembly, this component here, is also symmetrical front to back. I didn't put it in over here, though I guess technically you could, but I am just utilizing them somewhat to provide some location, if you will, some idea of where these things are located. And I did this as well. It's not a fully dimensioned drawing sheet like you're used to. This is just like the assignment says, to give you an idea of where these components are located relative to each other. So hopefully this helps you out. Provide as few dimensions as you can to just give us an idea of where components are located relative to each other, but we're not looking for you to go too crazy with this. We're more so looking for you to understand how to put in a parts list, balloons, work with the assembly drawings, and some minor dimensions for an assembled drawing sheet. Okay, I hope this has been helpful, and if you have any questions, please reach out to us.